When I received the old leather-bound journal in the mail, it came with no return address, just my name written in my sister's handwriting. I hadn't seen her in over a year. The police report called it a voluntary disappearance, but I never believed that. Emily wasn't the type to run away. The journal arrived on a Monday morning in Charleston, South Carolina, the same town where we'd grown up, where every neighbor still whispered about the missing Ward girl. I opened it carefully, and the first page made my hands tremble. "If you're reading this, Matt," she wrote, "they finally did what they always planned." The rest of the pages were full of places, names, dates, our family's names scribbled beside sums of money, addresses of lawyers, and one entry that stood out. March 3rd, they found out about the land. Uncle Robert threatened to make me disappear if I told you. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, trying to make sense of it. Our father's will had always been a sore spot, a small fortune left behind, but the paperwork was full of strange clauses. Emily had fought it in court once, claiming someone forged signatures, but she'd lost and vanished weeks later. The next day, I drove to the address she mentioned in one of her entries, a storage unit just outside Mount Pleasant. It smelled like dust and gasoline. Inside, I found a stack of legal folders, boxes labeled estate records, and a half-burned photo of Emily standing beside our uncle's car. That car had been sold months before she went missing. In one box, I found a flash drive taped to the inside lid. It was labeled "Do Not Trust Them." I plugged it into my laptop at a nearby cafe, my heart pounding. The screen filled with scanned documents, bank transfers from my uncle's company to a lawyer in Colombia, and a file titled Land Deed Revision. It showed Emily's name removed from the original 2 weeks before our father's death. My throat went dry. She had proof, and now I had it. But as I read further, I noticed something else, a hidden camera feed, a timestamp from a week before her disappearance. The video showed her arguing with 2 men in our father's old study. I froze when one of them turned toward the camera. It was Robert. The second, someone I didn't recognize, had a tattoo on his wrist, the kind I'd seen before on men who worked for local debt collectors. I printed everything and took it to the police, but the detective barely looked at the files. "This is circumstantial, Mr. Ward," he said. "People fake paperwork all the time. You don't have a body." That's when I realized Emily's case was never going to be reopened. They didn't care. On my way home, a dark SUV followed me for half a mile before turning off. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe they knew I was digging. I parked blocks away from my apartment, too afraid to go straight home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Emily had written. "If I disappear, look in Dad's office. The real deed isn't on paper." I hadn't been inside that house in years, not since we sold it after his death. But if she was right, something was still there. At dawn, I drove to the old house. The gate was locked, the windows boarded. It felt smaller, emptier. I broke in through the back door and walked straight to my father's study. The smell of cedar and dust hit me instantly. Everything looked the same. The bookshelf, the old typewriter, the portrait of my mother above the fireplace. I searched behind drawers, inside hollow books, even under the floorboards. For hours, nothing. Then I noticed the picture frame on the wall was slightly crooked. When I lifted it, there was a small recess behind it, just big enough for a metal box. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a single cassette tape and a folded envelope. The tape was labeled June 18th, the day before Emily vanished. I drove to a pawn shop to find a cassette player. When I pressed play, Emily's voice came through, shaky, scared. "Matt, if you find this, Uncle Robert lied. He forged Dad's will, sold the land, and someone helped him. They're watching me. They followed me to the lawyer's office. I don't think I'll make it home tonight." There was a loud bang, then muffled voices, then silence. I nearly dropped the player. The envelope held one more clue, a key to a safety deposit box at a bank in Colombia. I didn't know whether to cry or throw up. Emily hadn't just left a trail, she left a warning. By the time I left the shop, the same dark SUV was parked across the street. The driver's window rolled down just a few inches, and I caught a glimpse of that same tattoo. I didn't go home that night. I slept in my car at a rest stop off I-26, gripping Emily's journal to my chest like a shield. I thought about calling the police again, but what could I say? That the people who stole my sister's inheritance were now coming for me? Charleston felt smaller with every passing mile, like the walls were closing in. Somewhere, Someone knew exactly how much I'd uncovered. And I could almost hear Emily's voice in my head. Don't stop. Don't let them bury me twice. The safety deposit box was an hour and a half away in Columbia, and every mile of highway felt like driving with a target on my back. I kept checking the rearview mirror, waiting to see that same dark SUV, but either they were gone or much better at hiding than I was. The bank sat on a quiet corner near the university, brick walls, tall windows, completely ordinary, except my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I walked inside. The clerk asked for ID and the key. When she returned with the box, my pulse hammered so hard I thought she could hear it. Inside were two things, a sealed manila envelope and a folded piece of notebook paper with my name on it. Her handwriting. If you're reading this, I didn't run. They took me. Inside the envelope were original land deeds with our father's signature, authentic, notarized, dated before any revisions. Proof she was cut out illegally. Proof the police ignored. And beneath the papers was a cell phone, an old one, cracked, taped shut. When I powered it on, it opened without a password. There were only 2 videos saved. The first was shot from inside a car, the city blurring past the windows. Emily's breathing was fast, panicked. They know, she whispered. Robert sent someone. He knows I talked to the lawyer. If I don't make it, give this to someone who isn't afraid. She turned the camera briefly toward the seat beside her. A man's shoulder, a tattoo on his wrist. The same one I'd seen outside the pawn shop. The second video was darker, maybe a warehouse, maybe a garage. Emily's voice trembled. Tell Mom I tried. Tell Matt I'm sorry. Then a shout. The phone dropped. Boots. A man's voice. We said no loose ends. The video ended there. I sat in the bank vault room staring at the screen, trying to breathe. My sister didn't disappear. She was hunted. And now I was holding evidence that could destroy the people who did it. Evidence worth killing over. I left the bank with the phone and the deeds tucked under my jacket. The air outside felt too quiet. Too still. That's when I saw him. Leaning against a black SUV, sunglasses, shaved head, that same tattoo. He wasn't even hiding anymore. When he stepped toward me, adrenaline surged. I bolted through the parking lot, jumped into my car, and locked the doors as he reached for the handle. He didn't break the window. He just smiled, tapped twice on the glass, and mouthed, too late. I drove back toward Charleston with no clear plan except, don't die. Every hour that passed, the files in my passenger seat felt heavier. No police would listen. My uncle had money, lawyers, connections. Emily must have known that. That's why she left a trail for someone who'd never give up on her. Halfway home, my phone rang, an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then a voice. Matt? This is Attorney Parker. I worked with your sister before she disappeared. My stomach dropped. Parker was the lawyer mentioned in the journal. He said he had been threatened if he testified, and that Emily had given him copies of the same evidence I found. Your uncle isn't just stealing property, he whispered. He's laundering money through the land deal. Your sister found out. That's why they wanted her gone. I asked him why he was calling now. Because I heard you're being followed. And because they'll come for you next. He gave me another address, a storage unit outside Columbia, and told me to meet him there. When I arrived, the place was empty except for Parker, pacing nervously. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He told me he knew where Emily was taken. Not buried. Not gone. Taken. A private rehab facility outside Greer. Unregistered, off the grid, where wealthy families sent relatives they wanted out of sight. Emily might still be alive. Injured, drugged, silenced, but alive. I didn't know whether to believe him, but the hope hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. Then I heard footsteps. The tattooed man stepped through the doorway with 2 others. Parker's face went pale. I told you they'd come, he whispered, but it wasn't fear. It was guilt. He had led them. Betrayed us. The men blocked the exit. The tallest one cracked his knuckles. The tattooed man looked at me like a chore he was tired of doing. For a split second, I considered handing everything over. Phone, deeds, the journal, all of it, just to live. But then I heard Emily's voice in my head. Don't let them bury me twice. I grabbed the metal lock bar from the side wall and swung with everything in me. Chaos erupted. Shouting, crashing, Parker screaming. I broke past them and ran. Somehow, I reached the car. Somehow I got away. I didn't stop driving until Charleston's lights appeared on the horizon. I couldn't go home, so I went to the one person who might help. Detective Harris, The only cop who had ever shown any sympathy about Emily. He looked through the deeds, the videos, the files. His face changed. This is enough, he said. Enough to open a case. Enough to put them away, if we can keep you alive long enough to testify. And for the first time since the journal arrived, I didn't feel alone. But the danger wasn't over. Because if Emily was still alive, they'd never let me find her. And I wasn't stopping until I did. That night, Detective Harris hid me in a safe house apartment above a closed hardware store near the Charleston Marina, a place that smelled like dust and ocean salt, and every distant sound felt like a threat. I couldn't sleep, replaying the warehouse, the betrayal, the fists, the narrow escape. And every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Emily tied to a bed somewhere, sedated, waiting for someone who might never come. So at sunrise, we drove to the unmarked rehab facility outside Greer, a long, abandoned brick building surrounded by pine trees and a chain-link fence. No signs, no staff cars, just a camera pointing at the gate that turned toward us like a living eye. And Harris tapped his badge on the intercom, demanding entry under suspicion of illegal detention. But no one answered, just static, until a buzzer finally clicked and the gate rolled open, scraping across concrete like a warning. Inside, everything looked wrong. Wheelchairs abandoned in hallways, medical charts scattered. On the floor, coffee cups half full, like everyone vanished mid-shift, and Harris kept one hand on his gun, whispering that someone had cleared the place fast. Maybe because they knew we were coming. Maybe because Parker talked. Maybe because they were moving patients to another location. And I kept calling Emily's name, even though Harris told me to be quiet. And after 20 minutes searching empty rooms, I found a locked steel door at the end of the basement corridor, bolts, keypad, heavy, hinges. Harris radioed for a warrant, but I wasn't waiting, not after everything. So I grabbed a fire extinguisher and smashed the keypad until sparks flew and the metal cracked open. The hallway beyond reeked of bleach and something worse, something like fear. And inside were 3 empty beds with restraints still dangling, for lines cut, monitors unplugged, notebooks filled with patient names coded as involuntary. And in the last room, taped to the wall, was a Polaroid of Emily, eyes half open, bruised, a date scrawled under it, 3 days ago, which meant she had been here alive, very alive. But now she was gone. I dropped to my knees because I had let myself hope she was dead, because death was cleaner than this. But Harris grabbed my arm and said, "They moved her, Matt. If she was still worth keeping hidden, she's not gone." And he was right, because on the desk in that room was a transfer sheet with a signature I recognized instantly. Uncle Robert, the same looping are from every birthday card, every check, every fake smile. And next to his name was the destination. Harborview Medical Transport, a private company that specialized in quiet transfers for wealthy families. And when Harris ran it through the state database, the address wasn't a hospital at all, but a gated house on Kiowa Island, a place rich men bought when they wanted privacy. And rage settled into my blood like fire because this wasn't business. This wasn't greed. This was personal. This was punishment. This was erasing the daughter who wouldn't obey, and now they were trying to erase the son who wouldn't shut up. Harris called it in as a kidnapping and demanded backup, but dispatch said jurisdiction complications. Said they needed evidence, said they needed time we didn't have, and I saw the moment Harris realized it too, because he tossed his phone on the passenger seat and said, "If they move her again, she's gone. Get in." And we sped toward Kiowa, tires screaming, storm clouds gathering over the coastline like the sky knew exactly what we were driving into. And halfway there my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, just a picture of me standing in the bank parking lot, taken from a distance, time-stamped 1 hour ago, and a message, "Turn back while you still have something left to lose." And I knew that meant they were watching every step, every attempt to save her. And if I backed down now, Emily would vanish forever. So we kept driving until the pavement narrowed into a private road lined with oaks, the ocean roaring nearby, and a white mansion appeared behind wrought iron gates, guards pacing with radios, vans that weren't medical but armored transport with blacked-out windows. And Harris whispered, "They're getting ready to move her." And that was all it took. Adrenaline drowned out fear, and we climbed the fence while the guards circled the gate. And I slipped through a back door into a hallway that smelled like chlorine and antiseptic, and I heard voices in the distance. Men arguing, one of them saying, Just sedate her again. Once the paperwork's signed, she's not his problem anymore. And another replying, he wants her gone permanently this time. And every step forward felt like walking into a loaded gun barrel. But I wasn't stopping, not when she was so close, not when I had spent months believing she was dead, when the world told me to forget her, when my own family traded her life for property. So I followed the voices toward a room with locked double doors and cameras above them. And through a small window I saw a bed, restraints, machines humming, and a thin figure with dark hair lying still. And even though her face was turned away, I knew my sister was here. I didn't wait for Harris. I slammed my shoulder into the double doors until the metal latch snapped, and every guard in the hallway heard it. Because suddenly radios crackled and boots thundered toward us, but all I saw was Emily. Hooked to and fore, wrists restrained, mouth taped, her eyes fluttering weakly when the door burst open, and the sound she made wasn't a word, just a broken gasp that told me she knew I came. I ripped the tape off, whispering that she was safe, but her voice was paper, thin, whispering, "Don't let him take me again." And before I could answer, Uncle Robert stepped out from behind a curtain with two men in medical coats who had no business holding syringes, and he smiled like seeing me here was an inconvenience, not a threat, and said, "Matthew, you're interrupting a medical procedure," like I was a child making noise during dinner. And rage went through me so fast I barely heard Harris shouting at the guards behind us, telling them to stand down, identifying himself as law enforcement, waving his gun, warning them that if they touched me or the girl, the charges would bury them. And some of the guards hesitated, unsure if this was a kidnapping or a hospital call, especially when the men in lab coats didn't have credentials, just blank badges and nerves in their eyes. Uncle Robert told them to restrain me, that I was a danger to myself and others, that he had legal guardianship. And then he held up a document stamped, signed, and notarized, paper that declared Emily mentally unfit, a liability, a threat, and the realization hit me hard. This wasn't just about money. This was about erasing anyone who didn't follow his rules, turning us into ghosts with legal ink. And while the guards looked confused, Harris stepped between us and shouted that the paperwork was fraudulent, that Emily had never been examined by a licensed psychiatrist, that this entire operation was illegal detainment. And finally, one guard lowered his weapon, uncertain, but another didn't. He charged, and Harris tackled him, the gun clattering across the tile and disappearing under a cabinet, and chaos exploded in the room, all while Robert calmly pulled a syringe from the tray and moved toward Emily, telling her, "This won't hurt. You won't even dream." And that was when everything in me snapped. I tore the 4 out of her arm, grabbed the metal stand, and swung it at him, hitting his wrist and sending the syringe skittering across the floor, and he screamed, an ugly, human sound I'd waited my whole life to hear, while the lab-coated men lunged at me, and we all crashed against machines and monitors, cords ripping from sockets, alarms shrieking, and Emily fell sideways with the bed, weak and tangled in restraints. Everything was noise, Harris yelling, fists hitting flesh, guards arguing about who to obey, Robert crawling toward the fallen syringe, reaching like a desperate animal. And then I saw his hand close around it, and I knew if he injected her now, she was gone. So I dove across the floor, slammed his hand to the tile, and we fought over that needle like it was a loaded gun, his voice shaking with fury as he snarled, "You were supposed to stay quiet, Matthew, just like your sister should have." And in those words was the confession he'd been too arrogant to hide, and Harris heard it too. He turned, cuffed one guard, then the other, shouting into his radio. "Suspect admitted intent to harm victim. Facility compromised. Send every unit available." And suddenly backup became real, sirens in the distance, tires on gravel. And for the first time, Robert looked afraid, truly afraid, not of me, but of the world finally seeing who he was. And when the first officers burst into the room, weapons raised, ordering everyone to the ground, I held Emily against me, her head buried in my chest, trembling, whispering, "It's over." Even though I wasn't sure it was. They arrested Robert, dragged the fake medical staff out screaming threats, the guards surrendered one by one, and EMTs took over, checking Emily's vitals, asking how long she'd been sedated, how many doses, whether she'd been deprived of food, and I realized I didn't know any of those answers, because she had lived months that I couldn't witness, pain I couldn't undo. Nights she lay awake believing her own family had erased her. Harris put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You saved her." But I didn't feel heroic. I felt broken, terrified, and sick with guilt that I didn't protect her sooner. As they loaded her into the ambulance, she held my hand and whispered, "Don't let them put me to sleep." And I promised I wouldn't, climbed into the ambulance beside her, and watched through the back window as cops escorted Robert into a squad car, his face pale, his jaw trembling. And it should have felt like justice, but all I felt was the weight of the truth. This was only the beginning, because a man like him doesn't act alone, and someone out there had signed the papers, processed the transfers, took the money, and they wouldn't go quietly just because the police finally showed up. As the ambulance pulled away, I looked at Emily, alive, breathing, fragile, and I knew the next battle wasn't about finding her, but proving the world tried to erase her in the first place. They released Emily from the hospital after 2 days of observation, a thin paper bracelet still around her wrist and bruises along her arms where someone had restrained her too tightly. And even though the doctors insisted she was stable, she walked like someone expecting a hand to yank her backward at any moment, eyes flicking to every shadow, every door, every stranger. Harris arranged temporary protection and told us the arrest had triggered a full investigation into the clinic, the forged guardianship documents, the financial accounts Robert managed. But he also warned that these things moved slowly, that the people helping my uncle had power, lawyers, and friends in places we couldn't see, and that terrified me more than anything, because Robert might be locked in a cell, but the system he built still had a pulse. We stayed in a hotel near downtown Portland, blinds drawn, doors bolted, the TV muted so we could hear footsteps in the hallway, and at night Emily woke up, hyperventilating, whispering, "Don't let them put me back there." And I held her hand until her breathing slowed, pretending I wasn't shaking too, because I didn't want her to see how scared I was that someone might knock on the door with a badge and a fake court order and take her again before I could prove the truth. Then the real nightmare started. Lawyers showed up at the police station claiming to represent the family, arguing that Emily was mentally unstable, that she had a history of delusions, that her statements couldn't be trusted, and they said it with confident voices and expensive smiles, because money makes lies sound official, and suddenly everything felt fragile again. But Harris wasn't giving up. He dug up surveillance from the clinic that showed Emily being wheeled in against her will. He found signatures on medical forms that didn't match hers. He connected the dots in a way that made the detectives finally stop treating this like a family dispute and start seeing it as a criminal operation, maybe even trafficking disguised as mental health care. And while that word made my stomach flip, I knew it explained everything. The secrecy, the false diagnoses, the forged documents, the money moving between accounts in strange increments. One evening, while Emily slept, I sat at the edge of the hotel bed scrolling through her phone, the one she had hidden months ago before they took her. Photos of bruises on her wrists, timestamps of calls she tried to make to the police that never went through, a video she recorded from under a blanket, whispering that Robert wasn't working alone, that a woman named Dr. Brian approved all the paperwork, that she was the one who wrote the false evaluations, and in that second I understood just how close we were to losing her. If they had a doctor signing off on everything, they could disappear her forever, bury her under medical files and guardianship orders, and nobody would ask questions. I forwarded the video to Harris, and within hours he called, breathless, saying they'd found Dr. Brian's signature on a dozen other cases, young adults who suddenly went missing, some declared unstable, others shipped to long-term care facilities, and no one fought it because families trusted the paperwork. We weren't just dealing with greed. We were dealing with a machine, and we'd become the crack in the metal. The next morning, the police raided the clinic, seized computers, interviewed staff, and arrested Dr. Brian at her home in Lake Oswego. And when news broke, the story spread faster than any of us expected. Reporters calling, cameras outside the courthouse, headlines about medical fraud and involuntary detainment. And suddenly people were coming forward with stories of relatives who vanished into the same system. Robert's lawyers tried to get him released, claiming the accusations were exaggerated. But the judge denied bail after prosecutors presented evidence of attempted chemical restraint and financial exploitation, and I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was numbness, like my body hadn't caught up to reality. Emily and I sat on the hotel floor eating cold pizza, too exhausted to speak, and she said something I'll never forget. "I thought you forgot me." And I told her the only honest thing I had left, that I would have burned the world down to find her, even if it killed me. And she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." But I was, because every victory felt like a warning that the people we beat weren't done, that someone bigger and richer and smarter was going to come for us next. Then Harris called again. There would be a court hearing in 3 days, and we would have to testify, face the lawyers, face the judge, face Robert, and prove that Emily was sane, coherent, and a victim, not a danger, and the thought of sitting across from him made her hands start shaking again. So I took them in mine and said we would do it together. And for the first time since she came back, she nodded without fear in her eyes. But as I lay awake that night, listening to her breathe, staring at the hotel ceiling, I understood the truth. The fight wasn't over, not even close. Because when families try to erase you, the world believes them first, and you have to survive long enough to change the narrative. The courtroom felt smaller than it really was, and every breath seemed loud enough to echo. When the judge entered, everyone stood. When we sat, my heartbeat refused to calm down. Rebecca wasn't looking at me. She stared straight ahead, chin lifted, pretending the bruises weren't fading under her makeup. Robert sat at the opposite table with his lawyer, confident, bored, like a man waiting for a taxi, not a verdict. The prosecutor began with what they had. The photos from the basement, the medical report proving the blood found was Rebecca's, the ripped calendar pages with addresses and dates only she and he would know. Then came the part that twisted my stomach. The judge requested to see the diary. My lawyer asked me one last time, "Are you sure?" But there was nothing else left. I nodded. The diary was placed on the stand like evidence of a crime no one wanted to believe. The judge read parts aloud, detailed descriptions of threats, payments to men no one could trace, meetings in abandoned industrial buildings. Every word painted a picture of a sister no one ever bothered to save. Robert's lawyer tried to dismiss it as fiction, emotional exaggeration, paranoia, self-inflicted drama. But then the prosecutor asked him a simple question. If she invented everything, why did we find her blood in your basement? That, finally, cracked him. His foot started tapping, his jaw tightening, his eyes shifting away. When Rebecca took the stand, the room went silent. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger. She told them everything. How he wanted the inheritance for himself, how he locked her, how he kept saying no one would believe her, that a missing woman was easier to erase than a living witness. The judge listened without blinking. When she finished, Robert stood up and shouted that she was lying, that we all wanted to destroy him, that he was the real victim. Bailiffs had to hold him as he screamed her name like she was the one who betrayed him. The verdict wasn't a surprise, but it still hit like a shockwave. Guilty on all charges. People gasped. His lawyer lowered his head. Robert looked at me with pure hatred, like this wasn't the end but a promise. After it was over, Rebecca walked out of the courthouse with her coat wrapped tight around her, looking like a ghost finally allowed to breathe. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "It's done." Except it wasn't, not really. A few days later, we received another package. No return address, just like the diary. But this time it was a small flash drive. On it were recordings, secret meetings, whispered conversations, more than just Robert. Other relatives, lawyers, business partners. The conspiracy was bigger than we thought. Rebecca stared at the screen, pale and shaking, and said something that made my blood run cold. If we expose all of them, someone else will try to finish what he started. I told her we were done, that we had enough pain for one lifetime. But she smiled for the first time since we found her, sad, tired, but determined. A disappearance didn't stop them, she said. A verdict won't either. That night, she packed her things. She didn't say where she was going, only that she needed to close the last chapter herself. She hugged me once, gentle, fragile, and left before dawn. Weeks passed. No calls. No messages. Every unknown number made my heart jump. Sometimes I imagine she's standing somewhere with that flash drive, facing the people who thought they owned our lives. Sometimes I think she's already gone. And sometimes, I fear the next diary won't be written by her, but about her. The last page of her old diary still lies on my desk. It says only one sentence. If I go missing again, don't look for me. Finish what I started. Now the phone keeps ringing at night. No voice. Just breathing. I don't know if it's her or them. And I don't know which one scares me more.